Hello guys, gals, and those in between. We're back once more with a hopefully more stable schedule going forward. After facing chaos and doing a more modern trip, it's now time to talk about something more retro. A fascinating game released when Square were at the top of their game. A piece of media that was a sequel to a book that was not released in America for over a decade. So sit back, relax, and let's try to stop our mitochondria from attacking us as we head into Parasite Eve. Now, as usual, we need to look at the creation of this game, and that it's from a different time. Well, that's most of the games I've looked over. But similar to Fear Effect, I honestly feel like this game, Parasite Eve, would just never be made in today's day and age. This isn't your old classmate on social media raging that the sensitive people of today won't ever make some film again, ignoring the fact that there are plenty of media that continues to push the boundaries of what we can joke or talk about. I mean more so that because of how games are as a business nowadays, we can't really see a scenario like this ever happen again. Don't worry, this isn't going to turn into a 1-hour video essay on how, well actually, did you know Dark Souls is really about class warfare and late-stage capitalism? It's more so games nowadays are simply more expensive, and a lot of big-name publishers are hooked on that AAA thing. Heck, some are saying we gotta go beyond that, we gotta go quadruple A, which, dear God, please no. The idea is we gotta make these massive games, and as budgets increase into these select titles, there's less to go around for everyone else. And those select titles, because there's so much money invested into them, they're less likely to say be a new IP or to take a risk. Now, that might change in the future. Even reports from Square have said there should be some balance. Yeah, release your AAA Final Fantasy games, but also let's make sure we're releasing more other niche titles, some double or single A's. With how gaming is today, Parasite Eve would never be made by Square. I doubt it would even enter any concept art pre-production. Parasite Eve the game is based on a book that was actually not available in English until 2007. To put that into perspective, an official English translation for this book was released a full year after the PlayStation 3 was available. That's what I mean by it could not be made today. In today's gaming industry, I don't see any big name developer being like, so we got this book, only released in Japan, to critical acclaim. We're gonna make a sequel to this book as a video game that again is only available in Japan. I don't think there's any game or media that was in a similar situation. And yes, before you comment, because I know you will, The Witcher was indeed a game based on a book series that was not released in America until after the game. However, while CD Projekt Red are a major company now, at the time they were simply a distributor that changed to a developer, and The Witcher was the first game. They were not a major player. The CD Projekt Red of Witcher 1 is not the same one of Phantom Liberty. Same with 4A games with the Metro series. In both cases, those were at the time smaller studios taking on passion projects that would later spawn hit franchises, and not an established developer gambling on a Japan-only book. A Japan-only book whose game was being marketed by gaming magazines like EGM as Square's big follow-up to Final Fantasy VII. It was being marketed as something entirely new, a cinematic RPG. It would be like now, after the success of Final Fantasy VII Rebirth, Square would say our next big project to rival that is another entry in Parasite Eve. So yeah, I'm confident when I say I don't think we'll ever see a big name publisher ever make such a play like this again. The only other game based on a book in recent memory has been Hogwarts Legacy, which, hate it or not, it is once more a massive multimedia franchise. It's about corporate synergy. Hogwarts Legacy plays into bigger plans to keep that IP alive for a fabled 10-year television series reboot. For Parasite Eve, there was no multimedia plans, it was simply, here's this pretty great book, and we have a great idea to make a game and continue that story. And speaking of that book, let's talk about it for a bit. Now, this is the second time I've read a book for one of my videos, and unlike the last time, I can actually really recommend this one. I won't go too into the story because it's spoilers for the actual game, but I will say the game actually does a great job of making sure you actually don't have to read the book. It takes bits and pieces from the novel, but it's so well written as its own story, you don't have to actually read the book. But honestly, you should. It's a quality piece of work. The overall premise is that mitochondria, that thing that exists within your body, is a separate organism, which is a true fact. The mitochondria, however, are sentient, and have been waiting for an opportunity in order to break free and supplement humanity as the dominant species. They are tired of this symbiotic relationship. As a fan of horror and sci-fi, I can only give credit to the author, Hideaki Senna. I've said it before that a lot of science fiction tends to get too up into itself with explanations and terminology. Basically, if I gotta open up a dictionary or a secondary book to understand what I'm reading, I just give up. I shouldn't be having homework. Here, Hideaki shows he's not only a great writer, but also a great communicator of science. He actually has a PhD in pharmacology, but just because one is great in the scientific field doesn't necessarily make them a great communicator of it. Senna, however, is both, knowing when to go into detail and giving us just enough so we can move the story forward. He knows the science in this science horror is only a vehicle to get us to the ending, to drive the narrative. It's the engine and not the star. Whenever there are more advanced terms, he very easily condenses it. There are times when one of the characters are talking and says, "This is the so-and-so, the big doohickey," and it's then explained what it does and relates to the overall plot, a la its function is used to look at liver cells. The terminology and the overall conversations are never so dense that one needs a minor in science in order to keep up. So long as you got a high school understanding of biology, you'll be more than fine. I think this is what helped propel the book, it not being so weighty and having a great hook. The idea of this enemy inside you waiting to take over that's merely been using you, your family, everyone as a vehicle. An enemy as old as humanity itself, and because of our collected genes, all of humanity sharing a mitochondria from a common ancestor, we're all vulnerable to this being that fails to see us as people and sees us as the parasites that it's been chained to for millennia. Needless to say, I love the premise. And with the success of the book came a movie adaptation in its home country of Japan. And it's varying levels of okay. It's well acted, or I think it is. Even as a professional weave, I can admit it's hard to notice when the acting of another country is subpar. Subs over dubs for life though. Seeing the movie, I thought it was okay. The only version I can find is this low quality, non-high definition version. Even looking online, it doesn't look like there's been any production company that's bothered to make more copies or to high scale it. Minus fan projects, which I can kinda see why. This has the quality of a made for TV film. There was actually an interview with Hideaki where the person who was interviewing him said it was a TV movie, and he had to correct them saying actually it was released in cinemas. Which it was, but the on-screen product kinda speaks for itself. Even most reviews were mixed, saying that there are some good ideas here, but they're really underdeveloped. Keep in mind, most of the book involves a man going through grief that his wife is dead and a little girl having anxiety over a kidney transplant. It's only in pieces interlocked and the end when the villain ascends and things get ramped up. The film's biggest flaw for me is the pacing at almost 2 hours. It does drag, and the movie doesn't know whether it wants to be this film centered on grief or a monster blowing people up. I'm not the only one who thinks this. Even the director, Masayuki Ochiai, I hope I pronounced that correctly, stated that he felt he was pushed for a more sappy ending, and he had to make so many compromises the film could not be a true horror film. It also had only 8 weeks to film, which seems short for a movie that's close to 2 hours. One word of praise is, well, the music. Somehow Joe Hisaishi, the dude who's done dang near every Studio Ghibli soundtrack and accomplished composer in his own right, was attached to the film. You can see the movie if you want, but I can't wholeheartedly recommend it. Its biggest flaw was that, well, this came out in a time when J-horror was really exploding in the West, things like The Ring and The Grudge, so something that was just okay was not just okay. In a bit of irony, Ochiai himself would later direct 2 of the Grudge films. So my recommendation, skip the movie, read the book, and thankfully, us fans would get a better follow-up in less than a year in an entirely different medium. While the movie was being made, Square had actually gotten the rights for the game, and Parasite Eve is notable for a few reasons. The first is that this was actually Square's first M-rated game, which talk about a gamble. Films and games typically try to go for the lowest rating they can, because there's a larger audience pool, and a higher rating limits the amount of people that can purchase your game. Because, yeah, some people see that teen for teen rating and say, not my kid. And M rating also limited where and when you can advertise your product. A second and more noticeable fact for Parasite Eve was that it was the first game to be part of the Square EA partnership. A combo of the past, Square and Electronic Arts had a deal going where they formed two separate companies. One which was called Squaresoft Electronic Arts, and the other was called Electronic Arts Squaresoft, because that's not confusing at all. The former saw EA responsible for publishing and marketing Square games in the West, while the latter saw the inverse, with Square publishing and marketing EA games like Call of Duty in the East. Both companies had a financial stake in these new twin entities with a 70-30 split, the lion's share going to the developer. Squaresoft clearly benefited more from this deal than EA. Just a lot of EA games don't resonate with an Eastern audience, and they're all niche, whether they be shooters, and any sport, whether they be the extreme or normal variety, not named soccer or baseball. They just didn't have an audience to capture. Here, there was a market of hungry weebs that wanted what Square was dealing, and EA did not have that. There's only so many reverse weebs, Hideo Kojima included. Not to bash EA, we're actually gonna praise them because they were the perfect partner for Square at the time. It's because of them, Square games were pushed hard. I'd remember even back in the day, I'd be watching wrestling and they say this pay-per-view was brought to you by Final Fantasy X. So yeah, they actually did do their best to uphold their part of the bargain. And EA even marketed Parasite Eve as something new, a cinematic RPG, which we'll get more into later. Besides their expertise in this market, Square benefited from having a partner that knew the native language to proofread for any errors. Remember, Parasite Eve only came out a year after Final Fantasy VII, and the original is known for not only having a lot of grammatical errors, but also mistranslations that actually alter and lose crucial plot-critical points of the game. Mistranslations that to this day, Square has just never bothered to fix. Parasite Eve, that is not the case at all. There's a good deal of text here, and there was never a moment where I had to do a double take or be somewhat confused in regards to what was going on. EA also worked best because the game was going to be based in America. Originally, the idea was for Tokyo before it shifted to New York. Concept art from the game actually shows a dark-haired Aya who looked decidedly more Asian before development shifted. It does make me curious though, are we in a chicken and egg scenario? The Square just happened to make the switch before the deal? Or were they aware the deal was on the horizon and did it to prepare for said deal? Either way, this gave the game an iconic look by using a famous city like New York, going through Central Park and even a Natural History Museum. You don't really get an open world, but a map showing Manhattan, and honestly for the technology at the time, it's pretty impressive how they were able to capture these well-known landmarks. There's actually something surreal about playing a game about where I used to live, entering places I've been before, a populous city that is now empty. You're not in a mansion out in the middle of the woods or someplace cut off from society. You're in a city that houses millions, or did until something so horrid came that it cleared almost everyone out. It really does add to the overall horror of the game. Along with that shift in venue, the marketing was also genius because they claimed this wasn't just an RPG, this was a new type of RPG. This was a cinematic RPG. Literally in all the marketing of the game, they pushed out that this was just that. Not an RPG, but a cinematic RPG. Something new and fresh. It wasn't just the FMVs, but rather the overall pace of how the game is structured. It really does feel like another game I played for this channel, which was heavily inspired by cinema, that being Fear Effect. Seriously, it was one of my favorite videos to make. It's more an interactive film with some RPG and horror elements tossed in. We even see this in the first cinematic, where there's a lot of care for the cinematography to really draw the player in. Not only that, but also where they choose to place the actual camera in game, which we'll talk about later in the overall gameplay section. But honestly, I feel like a lot of modern games and modern Final Fantasy kind of owe Parasite Eve for attempting to feel like a major motion picture in its scale, its scope. Then again, it might be because of this we got the spirits within, but hey, you gotta take the good with the bad. The FMVs actually take up a lot of space. There's 20 minutes of them, and that's why the game is actually 2 discs, because of those 20 minutes. Aesthetically though, they're still pleasing. The PS1 was when 3D was first happening, and it has not aged well in a lot of areas. Many 8 and 16-bit games still look great, but when you first got to 3D, a lot of developers still hadn't fully figured out this newfangled technology, and thus the artistry could be put on hold, or they just tried just doing a 3D upgrade of something that was 2D and it didn't always translate so well. I've used this comparison before, but look at the difference between Final Fantasy VII and 9. 9 still looks really good. 7 does not. And the irony is that Parasite Eve actually uses the same engine that 7 does, and it looks loads better. What a difference a year makes. Even at the Tokyo Game Show and E3, Square was like, you don't need gameplay, just check out these sick cutscenes. It was the 90s, so there was a 1,000,000% chance someone said the word sick. Looking back at a lot of game magazines, the ones that even had demo discs with them, said the same thing. So much some reviewers were worried this was going to be a Trojan horse, that the game was going to look good, but it would ultimately be empty at the end of the day. Spoilers, it wasn't. Now that we got to most of the groundbreaking work in this game, let's talk about the team behind it. Like the cells in the human body, the people who make a video game are integral. And once more, Square was doing their best to make sure this succeeded. While being made in the West, they got some of their heaviest hitters to start work on this. The director was Takeshi Tokita, who had already had a crack on the director's chair, being the director for Live a Live and Chrono Trigger. Rest in peace, Toriyama-san. I think those games and Parasite Eve really show that when you need something new and breaking the mold, he's your guy. Live a Live is a strange game, and I honestly can't surmise it in a few minutes. The best comparison is to something like Killer 7 in that Live a Live is only like Live a Live. And Chrono Trigger... Look, we don't need another video talking about how great Chrono Trigger is. Maybe I'll tackle that one day, but Chrono Trigger is to this day considered one of the greatest RPGs on the SNES, if not just of all time. Of course, it would be shadowed by the far superior Chrono Cross. He also wrote the script for Parasite Eve, and he did a bang-up job. The author is also listed as a writer, but he didn't actually write the script for the game. According to an interview, he stated he had no idea the game was being made till it actually came out. But he was pleasantly surprised how well they adapted his work, which is pretty high praise. Adaptations are really hard because not only is there a source material that you can't butcher, but you have to change things up. From anything, whether it's a game or a movie, not everything is going to be a perfect one-to-one translation. So Takeda deserves a lot of credit for crafting this story. Yes, Sakaguchi of Final Fantasy fame came up with the concept, but Tokita had to do his fair share of work to fill in those gaps and make that concept come to fruition. The next big person was the composer Yoko Shimomura, who is a legend when it comes to music. It's funny, I remember when gaming channels really started up and people started talking about video game music, I would constantly hear about Nobuo Uematsu, the composer behind Final Fantasy, and of course Akira Yamaoka, with his mastery of ambiance, which I've mentioned before. But Shimomura and her music never really gets mentioned that much, and I cannot talk enough about how amazing she is. She started working with Capcom and helped compose almost all of the music behind Street Fighter II, minus 2 tracks, one being Sagat Stage. After that, she started working with Square, wanting to do Final Fantasy, but since it already had a composer, she was often assigned to do other notable Square titles like Live a Live, Super Mario RPG, and Front Mission. She's continued to leave a massive mark on Square with The Legend of Mana and dang near every Kingdom Hearts game. She is a legend, but we're here to talk about Parasite Eve, and Jesus does this soundtrack go hard. Being classically trained, she decided to add opera music to a medium that was still considered by many a fad and lowbrow, especially horror, which is still considered lowbrow to this day. Everyone talks about One Winged Angel being this grand operatic piece, which it is, but the soundtrack for Parasite Eve doesn't get talked about enough for rivaling it, and one can argue even surpassing it. She even decided to add techno to it. She had actually never even heard of techno before coming to the States for the development of the game, and some friends took her to a club, she heard techno, and she decided to add it in. Techno and opera, which should not work. You have on one side this somber and almost depressing song, mixed with this high energy and frantic beat. All the while there's a horse on fire, it's really almost sensory overload. This homunculus of a musical piece should not work. This Frankenstein synergy should fall flat, but it does not. But the battle music isn't really the only place where she really shines. When not in battle, the pieces she used really sense the ambiance. There really is something a bit depressing about the holidays where this game takes place. The holidays where there's no one around but you. It really captures the essence of a season with little sun where you're by yourself. When it first came out, reception to the soundtrack was mixed at best. Some people rightfully loved it. Others derided it, saying the opera doesn't fit with that kind of game and that it's awful or at best tolerable. These people were wrong. The soundtrack for Parasite Eve was so beloved, Square reprinted it 10 years later in Japan. I don't know many video game soundtracks that a decade later got reprinted just because demand was that high. The company was confident enough that they could actually make a profit on that. It was so beloved that during its creation, Shimomura actually got convinced to release a remix album. A video game soundtrack got a bunch of other artists to remix its tracks. It's pretty expensive, but you can find the actual tracks on YouTube, so feel free to check it out. As great as all that sounds, all of that would not matter if the gameplay wasn't at least up to snuff. I swear I'll get better at these transitions one day. Now, Parasite Eve tries to do something new by having both real-time action along with a turn-based system. When a battle begins, there's actually a bar that once filled, you can do what you wish. You can attack, you can use this game's version of what is essentially magic called Parasite Energy or PE, use items, do what you wish. Now, the speed at which this bar fills up is based on your level and also what kind of gun you're equipping. As opposed to normal RPGs, there's no swords or lances. Nope, it's all parry this, you filthy casuals. You're using guns. And I gotta say, I just love Japan's shock over American gun culture. From a gun just chilling in a shopping cart in Silent Hill 2, to a Japanese character in this game getting mind blown over the very concept of a gun store. Square was really like, this is taking place in America? Yeah bro, just guns everywhere. It doesn't matter. There are chests everywhere that have guns. A theater? The actors are packing heat. Central Park? Well, someone's gotta shoot those birds. A hospital? You never know when you might need that. You remove guns from hospitals and the terrorists win. Even a sewer. You find guns in the sewers. Imagine applying for a job in the sewers and they're like, okay, here's your machine gun. I feel like most people would opt out at that point. Now, all guns affect how fast you can actually start fighting, with lighter guns like handguns allowing for more action at reduced damage, and heavier assault rifles giving you the inverse. Whenever you do want to shoot, you get this cone to show the range of your weapon, which is something else you have to take into account. Enemies within the cone you can hit. Outside, you're gonna miss a lot of your shots, and if you do hit, it might be for a pittance, 1 or 2 damage at best. Now, before we get more into the actual battles, I gotta say I love the transition effect for this game. Typically in RPGs, there's a bit of a long wait, especially older ones, before a battle actually starts. But here, it's honestly really short. You get the color effect and the enemies appear. This quick pace really helps the narrative-driven scope of the game. Now back to the battles itself, when that gauge is not filled, you're free to run around and try to avoid enemy attacks, because they can also move. But there is a key problem. One is that as a horror game, Aya's speed can be rather slow. There was times I was wondering why I was even running because I know I would just get hit. I was able to avoid some attacks, but sometimes it felt like running just delayed the inevitable. Secondly, you can get into battles anywhere, and this being a game inspired by survival horror, there are a lot of areas that have odd camera angles. These areas are not well suited for the battle system of the game and make it difficult to attempt to avoid any hits. When you're not running, it's time to shoot, provided you have enough ammo. Each weapon also has an ammo stat, and most weapons also share the same pool of ammo, minus a few like the rocket launcher, which has its own special ammo. You can refill ammo outside of battles because if you run out inside, Aya has to reload and that does leave you open. Unlike most RPGs where your stats, techniques, or other things determine battles, here it's largely just your equipment. You do level up, but all the focus is on the armor and the guns that determine the majority of how much damage you deal and can take. Skills like poison resistance and other things are only on equipment and tied to said items. So for the most part, your level can be ignored. Even supplemental ways of boosting yourself are focused on purely your weapons and armor. Around the game, you'll find boosts you can apply to your equipment, whether that's an upgrade to range, attack, defense, etc. You can apply these on any equipment of your choosing, and fret not, you don't have to worry about giving all your attack mods to a pea shooter, only for it to be outclassed within an hour and regret wasting all your power-ups. To prevent that, the game provides what's known as a tool and a super tool. The tool allows you to transfer any stat bonuses or skill from one weapon or armor to another, and it comes at the cost of losing the item you're transferring from. So with that, sometimes you're going to have to make a decision on what you're prioritizing. Super tools are like normal tools, except the item isn't lost, however they're much rarer. So much you really only get them when you're nearing the end of the game. Now, I don't really hate the equipment system, but it's got that PS1 level of I'm not going to explain nothing to you. And you can find you just royally screwed yourself and lost the weapon you preferred, or added a skill that hinders you more than it helps. A key example is your rate of fire. Each weapon has a rate of fire that dictates how many shots you can take per turn. You might think, oh, I can give an assault rifle the rate of fire of a machine gun and pop off 10 rounds at full damage. What this game doesn't tell you is that rate of fire actually cuts your maximum damage. So having a rate of fire of 2 and 10 will always have the same amount of damage, except it would be divided by half or divided by 10. Also, shooting like 7 times will just leave you standing there taking hits. It only exists to punish the players. So yes, save before trying out a new gun or armor because you can screw yourself. Last sticking point is that there are status effects here in the game, and you can use items or parasite energy to solve it, but there's no point. What ends up happening is a monster will blind you because you're in an area you can't fully move. You cure yourself, and before you get another turn, you get blinded once more. I know I said last sticking point, but I mean it this time. You have a really small inventory space. It goes up whenever you level up, but it's really small. And keep in mind, one slot is always going to be used for ammo. Thankfully, as I said, most weapons share ammo, so you can get so much you never really have to worry about running out. Still, for a game focused on equipment, this limited space, while being a nod to its survival horror roots, is more cumbersome than anything. At its the only way to store items is in one central spot of the game, so if you're trying to get the ultimate weapon in the game, which requires 300 pieces of junk, it's going to be a lot of going back and forth between areas grinding. Which wouldn't be so bad, but the game actually discourages grinding, which is kind of a cool point. Grinding, for those who don't know, is when you just stay in an area and you just level up. Now, there are random battles here, but after a while it might start to take a few minutes to go ahead and find another battle. This is the way of the game telling you there's nothing else here for you, and the difficulty is nowhere near hard enough to warrant grinding. If you just do the battles you're supposed to and don't run away, you'll be fine. You even get an ability near the end of the game called Liberation, which is basically use this to kill the enemy. It's so overpowered that some players opt to not use it. Every time you level up, you get bonus points you can use to increase inventory space, increase your action gauge, or just power up your weapons and armor. And with how equipment-centric this game is, if you do it right, you'll have no issues. This breed of difficulty is no shock, seeing as the director also made Chrono Trigger, another game that feels like you can just do the same. Don't skip too many battles and you'll be fine. Well, minus one area, which we'll get to later in the video. Now, I don't hate the combat system of Parasite Eve. I think that a focus on equipment is a fine concept to take. Along with moving and a radius of effect, it's clear that narrative was the focus and thus combat is simply serviceable. Oddly enough, we would see the full evolution of this system a few years later when Square released Vagrant Story. Another RPG, except this time there were no levels, stats were awarded only after fighting a boss, and the stats itself were random. It was a game where the weapons and armor you wore dictated how hard or easy a battle would become. It also brought back that cone from Parasite Eve. It really was the systems in this game reaching its final form. Parasite Eve was the start of it though, so it's not terrible. As I said, it's pretty serviceable. Parasite Eve, as promised, is a cinematic RPG, so that's where most of the focus went. It's clear that the character and the narrative between them are the main crux of the game. Now, this game doesn't really have a wide and diverse cast like most RPGs, where sometimes you have up to 20 characters you gotta keep track of. Here, there's really only 2 that are the focus of this game. The first being the main character, Ayabrea, who is actually beloved by quite a large amount of people for various reasons. When being designed by Tetsu Nomura, the idea was for someone sexy, cool, and bewitching, which he probably said in that exact same tone. And like many protags of that era like Hana and Fear Effect, Aya got a lot of praise for the fact that this was a game where you played as a female main character. There was something of a renaissance during this era for women-driven narratives. Hana from Fear Effect, Lara Croft, and Ayabrea. They all had their issues, of course. I went over my issues with Hana and Fear Effect, mostly her marketing. But Aya didn't really have those problems. She was a woman who's an NYPD officer, so a woman in a male-driven workplace. Even today, a little over 13% of women make up any law enforcement body. The support she has are the men she works with, like her partner who has all the tropes of being a cop. Works so many long shifts, he lost his marriage, and there's even a scientist from Japan who fills in the story to help us in our journey. And they're just that. They're the assistants, supporting actors who might do a cool thing here and there, but never to the detriment of making Aya less than the hero she is. Aya got a lot of praise for not being a damsel, for not being sexualized, and for being the crux of this adventure. Now, Aya's screen time is at the detriment of almost everyone else. Now, this is a short game, so I don't really mind that there's no development for anyone else. Though it does feel odd because there are times it's clear the game wants you to care about some of these extras, but there's not enough there to actually warrant that. The only one I wish they did put more effort into is the secondary antagonist who assists Eve. All we really get is that he's a misanthrope that seems to hold contempt for humanity. I wish there was more to him, or we got an explanation as to why he is such a way. Because honestly, the man is assisting a creature that plans for a complete genocide of all living beings on the planet Earth. That includes people and animals, and replacing them with mitochondria. But we really get nothing from him besides people are weak and pathetic as his motivation. The only other person to get screen time is Eve. Now, she is not the same Eve from the novel, but she is mentioned, talking about her sister and how she learned from her sister's mistakes. Eve is the source of all the enemies encountered in the game, mutating animals. There's no goblins or orcs here, but everything from birds, rats, later even dinosaurs that have been horribly mutated by Eve. Now, the focus on just these two makes sense because femininity and all it comes with is a major theme of the game. Things like motherhood, nurturing, giving birth, these things are central pillars of the game. Eve, like her sister, seeks to go ahead and release all mitochondria by giving birth to a being who has full mitochondrial control. It's a rather brilliant move to center this around Christmas, because if Eve succeeds, she will be the mother of a new Christ, the start of a being that will destroy humanity as a new era takes control. The religious themes don't end there. The entire game takes place over a time frame of 6 days, just like in the story of Genesis. Eve is seeking to create a new world in that 6-day time frame. As the game progresses, not only does Eve continue to morph and look less human, a nod toward the book how the original Eve also had a time limit before she burned out her shell, but we also see her get more pregnant. And no one is excited for this upcoming birth minus her. Aya herself seems to have control of her mitochondria but goes against Eve. Rebellion, which is a theme that is central to the book and the game. Now, there is one more character, but they're pretty spoiler heavy, so we'll talk about them as we get more into the game. So the usual skip here if you want, I'll give you some time and we'll discuss Square's first cinematic RPG. Now, the book starts off with a car crash. A woman named Kiyomi gets into a car accident and is declared legally brain dead. Her husband, Toshiaki, opts to donate her organs for a girl who needs a kidney, and also opts to keep his wife's liver so he can study it. This is all a plot by Eve to create the ultimate being and have mitochondria replace humanity as Earth's dominant life form. She needed for someone to get a kidney from a body she controlled so she can implant the ultimate being, because otherwise the human body's immune system would rebel against it. As Liver Eve gets cultured in a lab, Toshiaki even thinks he sees his spouse's face in a collage of cells under a microscope. Eventually, Liver Eve gets cultured enough to make a body out of those clump of cells. Said Eve then assaults Toshiaki in order to gain his sperm and fertilize one of her eggs. Eve also then takes control over Toshiaki's assistant, revealing her intentions to replace humanity and seeing them as nothing more than vehicles for this moment. She then starts to set people on fire. Eve then makes her way to Mariko, the girl who got Kiyomi's kidney, in order to implant the fertilized egg to create the ultimate being, a being able to fully control and alter their DNA. Throughout the narrative, we learn that over the years, Eve would take over Kiyomi's body, having limited control over her, and she caused the accident to set the story into motion. She also reveals that she altered Kiyomi's body to get Toshiaki's attention. Because of his research, he was the man who would allow her dreams to come to fruition. So she made Kiyomi into Toshiaki's ideal partner. Everything from the shape of her face to even the size of her breasts. Eve altered Kiyomi specifically for Toshiaki. They were all just puppets dancing on her string. After implanting the egg in Mariko, the baby is born and it's a failure. You see, mitochondria is only transmitted by women, but there does exist male mitochondria. The book explains that normally male mitochondria is not passed, it's only passed via the mother when it's the same species.
However, when different species mate, male mitochondria is then shared. Because Eve and Toshiaki are different species, one being mitochondria, the other Homo sapien, the male mitochondria from his sperm carry through. Said mitochondria realized that in Eve's world there would be no place for them and they rebelled. The ultimate being was born and quickly began to die. Toshiaki decides to sacrifice himself, dying with his child as the story ends. An epilogue then states that some of Eve's cells were found and quickly destroyed. After that, a few years later, another mitochondria rebellion would take place on the other side of the world. The game begins with you at the opera. As the play goes on, eventually everyone starts bursting into flame and dying. Man, and I thought our American cousin had a death toll. Aya's date freaks out and decides he's got to get out of there. Aya then basically pushes him and confronts the actress of the play. As the actress notes, there's something strange about Aya. Before going any further, the police arrive, and to show this is a video game, they don't shoot on sight. Here, one of them can give Aya a ton of ammo, which I do find funny. Oh yeah, you can borrow about 100 bullets. What's 100 bullets between friends, really? Going into the backstage area, we see one of the first cinematics as this rat transforms into a monster. No joke, I had a family member who saw this when I was younger and it terrified him. The design of these creatures as mutated monsters still really holds up. After fighting the rat, we see our surviving cast member. We tell him to get the heck out of here, and then we find his charred remains outside. Investigating, we find out that this monster is or was named Melissa, who was suffering severe medical conditions, but refused to stop because she had to play this part. Eventually, you encounter Melissa, who refers to herself as Eve. A brief fight, we're down in the sewers, and we try to fight her, and instead we fight an alligator. Which I'm not sure younger viewers would get, but one of the most endearing local legends of New York are alligators are living in the sewers. A rather nice touch by Square incorporating local lore. Escaping the sewers, you're swarmed by paparazzi and your partner comes and just decks one of them. Back at the station the next day, a press conference happens where Aya reveals Melissa's goal has something to do with mitochondria. After being berated, you then get the trope of an overworked cop as your partner's son visits, and boy, a lot of this game holds up, but some of this does not. This boy looks ghoulish. With a lead on mitochondria, you then visit Dr. Hans Klomp, an expert in mitochondria and all-around misanthrope at the Natural History Museum, which now apparently hosts Chocobo. Hans goes on about how amazing mitochondria is as compared to human beings before deciding he's just tired of talking to you in general, and the cops don't push it for some weird reason. We then hear about Eve's location, Central Park, where your partner's ex-wife and son are going to be. He tries charging in only to get caught on fire. Aya heads in and discovers Eve has turned every human there into some kind of primordial sludge. Before you do one of the coolest fights of all time riding on the back of a horse that tried to cosplay Rapidash. Stopping her once more, your partner's son reveals that his mom saved him at the cost of her life. Collapsing, you wake up in an apartment with a Japanese man named Maeda, who talks about what Eve's goal is, how something like this happened in Japan involving cultured liver cells, and that this Eve may plan on creating the ultimate being like the first Eve. After some light robbery, you find the city's been abandoned, an emergency order with one line of dialogue stating, well, it's Christmas, so most of Manhattan was empty anyway, which is just... no. So you rob the empty stores, or rather use the power of eminent domain, before going into Hans' lab, where Maeda sees that Aya's cells seem to be able to resist Eve. Hans comes back, your partner sees that for some reason his ex-wife and son's name is on a computer for this obvious villain, and blows a gasket. But before anything can be done, your safe house for the past 2 days is no more and Eve attacks the police station. Here we get some scenes that try to stir emotions. Torres, who handles your weapons, dies, and it's revealed the reason he's so anti-gun was because his daughter died via a gun. He then hands you his gun and yeah, it's not as good as the one you're currently holding. So take this deeply emotional memento. Yeah, no thanks, bro. And he's dead. Your partner's son is once more caught up into this in what is arguably a more heartbreaking moment. Getting friendly with a police dog, the dog actively runs away because it feels itself changing. It feels Eve taking control and trying to make it something it's not supposed to be. While Eve is talking about replacing humanity, all beings will be changed or absorbed by her. Plus, no one likes seeing dogs get hurt, which sadly you see. Shiva the canine morphs into a Cerberus. The police station is the first place I felt like there was no space to fight. Even the boss is so big, it's cumbersome. You do an old yeller and your captain maybe dies, who really knows. So now your partner is the acting chief and it's time to head to the hospital. Here Maeda gives you what's supposed to be a good luck charm, which does nothing. Yeah, Maeda gives you 3 good luck charms throughout the game, which no one really knows what they do. Some people think it helps with drop rates, however, since no one's actually been able to look into the game's code, that's never been verified, and I've never noticed a difference, and since your inventory space is limited, yeah, just chuck that. Maeda says that because of the first Eve, this one will be looking for sperm, ones without male DNA. So in the hospital, Eve now deliberately tries to stop you even cutting the elevator. Before, she treated you as kind of an annoyance, but now that you know her goals, she actively sees you as a threat. In the hospital, you see records of Aya's mother and sister. Throughout the game, we see flashbacks of a sterile white room. Not the one from Stranger of Paradise, a different sterile white room.
You discover this is the very same hospital that you and your twin were at when you were younger.
And that after a car accident which killed both your mom and sister, you were given her eye, and your sister's kidney was actually given to Melissa. Melissa, who stopped taking her meds, which allowed her immune system to lapse and allow Eve to go ahead and emerge. Now, your mother's name is Mariko, which begs the question, is this the same Mariko from the book? Well, it seems not. This Mariko was born in the late 1970s, and the book never mentions a time frame, but we're supposed to assume it's sometime in the 90s where it was written. That does leave a giant question, of course, of, okay, so there's two Japanese women who just happen to have some connection to Mitochondria and Eve. So either this was just a nod to a book, or somewhere in the adaptation process, something came undone. I choose to believe it's the same Mariko because it just makes more sense as to why Aya has the powers she does. After discovering the files, you confront Eve. She leaves with a sperm and you fight a giant spider woman before having to jump off a roof. You can actually have an instant death here if you don't escape on time. Once that's done, it's day 5. You can either enter a warehouse with some tough enemies or follow Eve to the sewers where you see that primordial soup from the people in Central Park and drain it to stop her from infecting the city. After you switch disc, it's back to the museum where Hans explains that he has been helping Eve. He's the one who gave Maya's kidney to Melissa, knowing it would allow Eve an opportunity to come back. He's also the one that helped alter her stolen sperm so it would not carry any male mitochondria, and he reveals that Eve is now pregnant and expecting. Han tries to attack Aya, but he's stopped. He then tells Eve he's ready, and then he's killed. Aya tries to save him, with Hans just remarking how foolish humans are that she's trying to save him after all he did. Honestly, I wish we got more development of Hans as a tertiary villain. Why was he such a misanthrope that hated humanity so much? Also, did he think Eve would spare him? It seemed maybe he thought that was the case. Sadly, we don't have much to go on, and I really wish we had more. After fighting a really cool boss battle in a T-Rex, we see a heavily pregnant Eve about to give birth to the ultimate being. She uses all the genetic material from the people she absorbed as a sort of barrier to protect her child. Aya then fights Eve, beats her for the final time, and Eve starts wondering, why did Aya rebel? Why did she not choose to join her? The army fires missiles at the blob of cells hoping to kill it, but to no avail. The ultimate being is born. Before your actual fight, you see one of your cop buddies who offers to engrave a weapon and armor and do this. The only way to keep your current set in a New Game Plus is to engrave it, and you're gonna want to do that. Now for the fight itself, it's the same as others. Run, dodge, and shoot as it continues to mature. Eventually it evolves into a state where you cannot damage it. Maeda reveals he made some bullets from your cells, so your partner jumps out of a helicopter, gets set on fire, and tosses it to you. You trounce the ultimate being, but it's still alive, even with it falling apart. Suddenly, it becomes Resident Evil as you have to run away. If it catches you, you're dead, and you will have to fight the final boss all over again, which no one wants that. I had to because of PS1 jank. Transition to a new screen still holding the up button, as that was the last button pressed, and Aya decided to just die for fun. You go to the engine room, Aya says a one-liner, "This is Hell's Kitchen," you blow up the ultimate being and save the world. Maeda then muses that maybe humanity are the real parasites and we need to do a better job of taking care of the earth so that we're not seen as such. Sometime later, you all visit the opera as your eyes and everyone else's glows red, showing either Aya is controlling everyone, or rather Eve. The credits roll, and yeah, if you want a good ending, you need to do New Game Plus. New Game Plus is the same minus a few things. Number 1, any items saved at the police station carry over. So if you didn't engrave your weapons and armor, you might still stand a chance. Second, the enemies do get a boost, and lastly, there is a new location, the Chrysler Building, which sucks. So you can enter the building at any time, so long as you don't enter the room Eve is in the museum in this too. And once more, the building is bad. So the Chrysler Building is one giant sterile room for 77 floors, and you heard me right, 77 floors. See what's on screen? You better get used to that. Every floor has an entrance, a useless elevator, an exit, and a room with items. Items that are much better than the ones in the main game. So realistically, if you're getting everything, you're gonna be here a while as you find an exit only to realize you might have missed a great gun or armor. You also get trading cards which you can use to give your equipment more slots, and after a certain amount a tool set and super tool set which gives you unlimited uses of each. Now I found the Brady game strategy loadout and it seems minus the floors with bosses, each 10 floor you encounter a boss, every other level is randomized and no one has bothered to see how many randomizations they are because it's just boring. Parasite Eve's strength was in Aya's story and setting. Now we just have hallways as you have to push through battle after battle, which isn't too satisfying. The fights was not this game's strongest point, and for some reason developers thought, yeah, let's really shine a light on that. As stated, every 10 levels you go ahead and fight a boss, and you better hope you win, because when you do, you get an elevator key that will let you leave and save. This key only works on the previous 10 levels. So again, you better hope you're prepared, or else you might have to spend another hour or so going up all these boring hallways, and I'm not kidding, it might take at least an hour for every run to a boss. Mostly because everything looks so similar, you lose track of if you did something or not. There were times I was like, wait, did I actually get the equipment on this level or no? This dungeon also has new enemies that aren't in the first playthrough, like squirrels and bugs, and these guys are tough. I was somehow able to power through, but the secret boss kicked my ass 9 ways to Sunday because I was, wait, am I reading this right? Underleveled. So as I said before, for the most part, levels can be ignored minus here. If you are not at a high level, the last few bosses will be a major roadblock because now your level suddenly matters out of nowhere. So the only thing you can do is go ahead and grind. Yes, even though this game has anti-grinding measures. It seems like the developers knew this and yet still went ahead. So go to the last area of the game and level yourself up to level 38. After level 38, the game gives up. After that, the requirements for each new level are so minuscule, you'll level up after almost every battle thereafter. Most online resources from people who've played said 70 is a good range, but why not go all the way? So after getting my ass handed to me, I go back at level 99 and easily defeat the final boss.
The final boss is True Eve.
The one that resided in your sister Maya. She made her home in the Chrysler Building. In case Melissa failed, she would be a backup. This is actually greatly foreshadowed in the main game. During the hospital, you can see the Chrysler Building highlighted. Speaking of True Eve in the form of your sister, it says that it stood there in case the other Eve failed, and it would then assert control, which happens at the end of the game. You then fight the True Breed, who resembles Aya when she uses Liberate and has full mitochondria control. Another nice hit that gaining that power is what led to the bad ending. Finishing True Eve, another rebellion takes place, this time with the help of Maya. Aya is able to overcome True Eve's mitochondria and stop her plans from coming to fruition. Aya comes to terms with her twin's death and knows that Aya would always be there with her spiritually and physically, as the game ends with True Eve's plans finished. So that was Square's first cinematic RPG, and I highly recommend it. It's rather short and can be beaten in an afternoon without too much difficulty.
The one thing I can't recommend is the EX game, or rather New Game Plus. That's where the flaws really start to show, like the combat system, which while adequate would be refined in later games like Vagrant Story. So the main crux here is obviously the story, and it still holds up incredibly well. I could wholeheartedly say read the book and then the game, but the game also works fine without a companion piece. Its only real negatives are again just that New Game Plus, and also it has that PS1 era of not being player friendly, and you being able to screw up your save beyond belief. The game also had a hard time melding the genres of RPG and survival horror. Some of it stuck, but things like your inventory space, when it's a very item-centered game, conflict with each other. Still, with its themes of femininity, an enemy inside you, and rebellion, really weighty subjects that they're able to easily condense, and one of the best female protagonists for that generation, I say play it and enjoy the story. Sadly, this game isn't widely available. It's only an original PS1 disc and was only digitally released at the time of this writing on the PSN store, which is for the PS3, PSP, or PSTV, which is what I use to get footage. So for a lot of people, you might have to sail the high seas, but it's pretty worth it for a great narrative experience. Well guys, in between, that's it for part 1 of this new series. So obviously the next video is going to be Parasite Eve 2,
well, maybe not the next direct video. I'm thinking of doing some smaller projects in the meantime. Things that are like, 5, 10, maybe tops 15 minutes to kind of fill in the space between these sort of larger releases. But the next plan is for Parasite Eve 2, followed by the third birthday, and along with that, the future of the series. After that, again, I said I do still have more of some video plans in the works, so be on the lookout for that. For everyone who subscribed, thank you very much. So if you enjoyed the video, send it to your friends. If you hated this video, send it to your enemies. Thanks everyone for watching. Catch you later. Stay blessed.